Last December, our town was hit by a powerful blizzard like nothing we had ever seen before. Snow came down in waves, thick and heavy, suffocating everything in its path. The city was paralyzed, roads buried, homes frozen, and lives teetering on the edge of survival. That night, the power in my home went out. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, the kind that whispers, "You won't make it." I had no choice. I layered up, packed what little food I had, and stepped into the storm, hoping to find shelter at a nearby community center. The snow stung my face like needles, the wind roared in my ears, and visibility was nearly zero. But it wasn't the storm that terrified me. It was the sound. The faint crunch of footsteps behind me. I stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that makes your heartbeat deafening. I turned around, expecting to see someone, anyone. But there was nothing. Just endless white. I told myself it was paranoia. The storm was playing tricks on my mind. I pressed on, but the footsteps returned, closer this time. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the wind. Nothing. I quickened my pace, the snow rising past my knees. Every few steps I'd glance back, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the storm, and then I felt a shadow, tall, thin, and motionless. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. No answer. I stumbled forward, my chest tight with panic, but the shadow didn't follow. It just stood there, watching. Minutes felt like hours as I trudged through the snow, the bitter cold stealing my strength. Then I saw it. A house, dimly lit, its windows fogged. I practically ran to the door, pounding on it with frozen fists. An elderly man answered. He looked as weathered as the storm outside, his face pale and gaunt. "Come in," he said, his voice hollow. The warmth hit me like a wave, but the relief was short-lived. The man stared at me with a strange intensity, his hands trembling. "You shouldn't have come out," he whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked, still catching my breath. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the window and muttered, "They'll find you now." Before I could question him, a loud bang echoed through the house. It came from the back door. The old man froze, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here," he whispered. I didn't understand. I thought it was the storm battering the house, but then the banging grew rhythmic, deliberate. "Don't open it," the man hissed, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped toward the back door, peering through the frosted glass. At first I saw nothing. Then a face appeared, pale, hollow, eyes black as coal. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The old man began to pray, his voice shaking. "What is that?" I demanded. But he only muttered one word: "Wendigo." I laughed nervously, thinking he'd lost his mind, but the banging continued, louder and more insistent. The man grabbed my arm again. "They're not human. Don't let them in, no matter what you hear." The banging stopped. Silence. Then a voice. "Ryan." My blood ran cold. It was my mother's voice. "Ryan, please, I'm cold. Let me in." I froze. My mother was hundreds of miles away, safe and warm. This couldn't be real. The old man's voice snapped me out of my trance. "It's not her. Don't open the door." But the voice continued, pleading, sobbing. "Ryan, please. I'm so scared." Tears streamed down my face as I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out. Then, without warning, the lights in the house flickered and died. Darkness. The old man's prayers turned to screams as something shattered the back door. I didn't see it, but I felt it. A presence, cold and malevolent. The air grew heavy, and the room seemed to shrink. I ran. Out the front door, into the blizzard, my legs burning with every step. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The storm was relentless, but so were the voices. They called my name, each one more desperate than the last. Friends, family, even strangers. I heard them all. Then I saw her, Monique Alexander. Her face was on the news, one of the many who had perished in the storm. But there she was, standing in the snow, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she whispered. I froze, unsure if what I was seeing was real. She took a step toward me, her movements stiff, unnatural. Then I noticed her feet. They didn't touch the ground. I turned and ran, the wind howling like a banshee. But no matter how far I ran, the shadows followed. Dozens of them, faceless and silent, their dark shapes cutting through the whiteout. I collapsed in the snow, my body numb, my mind unraveling. This was it. I was going to die. But then I saw headlights. A plow truck, its horn blaring, cutting through the storm like a savior. The driver pulled me inside, his face etched with concern. "You're lucky I found you," he said. "People don't last long out here." I wanted to tell him about the shadows, the voices, but I couldn't find the words. He drove me to a shelter where I was treated for hypothermia. They said I was delirious, that the cold had played tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw. That night haunts me to this day. I can still hear the voices in my dreams, still see the shadows lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I survived the blizzard, but a part of me never left that storm. And every time I see the snow begin to fall, I wonder, are they still out there, waiting for their next victim? Stay safe, and remember, not everything lost in the storm stays buried. It all started on the second night of the storm. The silence was deafening. Snow piled high against the windows. The power had been out for hours, and the cold seemed to seep into our bones despite the fire crackling weakly in the corner of the living room. My family and I were huddled together under layers of blankets, listening to the howling wind outside. But then, we heard it. Something impossible. Something that sent a chill down my spine deeper than the icy air. Footsteps, crunching through the snow just outside our house. Slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter, as if someone, or something, was circling us. I shot up, heart pounding, and peered out through the frosted window. Nothing. Just the endless white of the storm and the skeletal outline of the trees bending in the wind. But the sound continued, steady and unnervingly close. My wife whispered, "Is someone out there?" And I could hear the fear trembling in her voice. I grabbed the flashlight, hands shaking, and stepped onto the front porch. The wind bit into my face, and the beam of light barely pierced the swirling snow. But there, in the pristine blanket of white, were footprints. Large, heavy footprints that started at the edge of the woods and circled the house. But no one was there. No shadows, no figures. Just the prints, and the sound of something crunching through the snow, though I could see nothing making them. I slammed the door shut and locked it, heart hammering against my ribs. That was the first night. The second night was worse. By then, the storm had trapped us completely. The roads were buried, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. We tried to distract ourselves with games by candlelight, pretending everything was fine. But then my daughter, Emily, looked up and froze. "Who is outside?" she whispered. I turned to follow her gaze. At first I saw nothing through the living room window, but then it moved. A shape, faint, pale, like the storm itself had taken form. It was there 1 second, drifting between the trees, and gone the next. I grabbed the flashlight again, desperate to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or a trick of the light. But when I opened the door this time, I didn't step out. I couldn't, because right there, in the middle of our front yard, was a figure. It wasn't solid, not entirely. Its edges shimmered and blurred as if it were part of the snowstorm. It stood motionless, facing the house, though I couldn't make out a face beneath the veil. I stepped back, slamming the door before it could turn toward me. That night, we didn't sleep. The third night, the whispers started. Faint at first, almost drowned out by the wind. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder. It sounded like voices, dozens of them, murmuring in unison. Words I couldn't make out, though they carried a weight. A sorrow that filled the room like a suffocating fog. And then Emily started crying. She said they were calling her name. My wife tried to comfort her, but the whispers didn't stop. They surrounded us, seeping through the walls, through the floors. And that's when I heard it, clear as day, my own name. A voice rasping it, dragging the syllables out as if tasting them. Brian. I bolted upright, grabbing the flashlight again, but this time the light flickered, sputtering as if the storm itself were swallowing it. My wife begged me not to go outside, but I had to. I couldn't just sit there, helpless, while these things, whatever they were, closed in around us. The cold was biting, the wind shrieking in my ears as I stepped out into the snow. The footprints were back, more of them this time, crisscrossing the yard like a chaotic dance. And then I saw it again. Not one figure, but many. They drifted between the trees, their forms barely distinguishable from the storm, but their presence undeniable. One of them stopped, turning toward me. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand as it moved closer. I could see it now. Its face, pale, as though drained of life, with a ghostly glow that flickers faintly in the dim light. And yet, I felt it watching me. It raised a hand, skeletal and frostbitten, pointing toward the house. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a sound. Like the wind howling through the cracks of an old, abandoned house. A sound that resonated in my chest, filling me with an unspeakable dread. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door and locking it. My wife was crying, Emily clinging to her. The whispers were deafening now, the walls seeming to vibrate with their intensity. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The storm began to die down the next morning. The figures didn't return, but the footprints, they were everywhere. Surrounding the house leading into the woods, and at the edge of the trees I found something. A weathered, frozen sign, half buried in the snow. I dug it out with trembling hands, the letters barely visible beneath layers of frost. Danger. Unmarked graves. We left as soon as the roads cleared, but I can't shake the feeling that we weren't alone during that storm. That those whispers, those figures, were the remnants of something long forgotten, buried beneath the snow and ice. I still hear them sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind is just right. Their voices, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. They've etched themselves into my memory, a constant reminder of the things we can't explain, the things that lie just beyond our understanding. It all started during the Texas winter storm of February 2021, a storm so brutal, it turned our warm, predictable lives into something unrecognizable. That storm, it wasn't natural, I'm sure of it now. I lived alone back then, in a quiet little house on the edge of a neighborhood that seemed to disappear when the snow began to fall. The first night the power went out, it was like the world had suddenly gone silent. No hum of appliances, no distant buzz of streetlights, just an eerie, oppressive stillness. And then, the creaking started. At first, I told myself it was the cold, the way wood shifts when temperatures drop. But this creaking, it was deliberate, slow, rhythmic, like someone pacing just above my ceiling. I remember standing in the dark living room, my breath fogging the air, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. But then I heard it again and suddenly it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I lit every candle I could find sitting in the center of the living room, wrapped in every blanket I owned. Every few hours, I'd hear the steps again, sometimes above me, sometimes in the walls. By morning, the sound stopped, but what replaced it was worse. The storm outside had intensified. Snow piled against the windows, turning my home into a frozen tomb. The temperature inside dipped below freezing, and I knew I couldn't stay much longer. But when I opened the front door, I froze. Not from the cold, but from the sight before me. My yard, once open and familiar, was gone. In its place stood trees. Dozens of towering, gnarled trees covered in frost, their branches twisting in impossible directions. The streetlights were gone. My car was gone. Even the neighbor's house across the street was swallowed by this unnatural forest. I stepped back inside and locked the door. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. By the second night, the cold was unbearable. I tried lighting a fire in the fireplace, but the logs wouldn't catch. They were wet, dripping actually, but not with water. Some dark, oily substance seeped from them, staining my hands and filling the room with an acrid smell. And then the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like the wind pressing against the house. But soon, the whispers formed words. My name, over and over again, from every corner of the room. Tahir, Tahir. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. It grew louder, angrier. Tahir! And then silence, and when I opened my eyes, the room wasn't the same. The walls seemed farther apart. The furniture cast strange, elongated shadows, and the air was heavy. I looked out the window and saw nothing but darkness. Not the kind of darkness you get at night. This was alive, pulsating, moving like a living thing. I swear I saw shapes shifting in it, eyes staring back at me. That's when I heard the knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. I didn't move. My body wouldn't let me. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I forced myself to my feet and approached the door, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. "Who's there?" I managed to whisper, but no one answered. I pressed my ear to the door, and a voice whispered back, not in words, but in a low, guttural growl that sent ice through my veins. "Let us in," it said. I stepped away from the door, trembling, and that's when I saw it. The thing standing in the hallway, stretched like the branches of those twisted trees outside. Its face was featureless, a smooth, pale void that seemed to absorb the light around it. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. It raised one long, clawed hand and pointed toward the door. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find, but when I turned back, it was gone. The door, though, it was wide open. Snow swirled inside, but it wasn't just snow. Something was crawling in the drifts, long and spindly, like the legs of a spider. I slammed the door shut and backed away, but the whispers returned, louder than ever. They were coming from the walls now, from under the floorboards, from inside my own head. "You can't leave," they said. "You're ours now." I don't remember much after that. Just flashes. Breaking the window with a chair, running barefoot into the snow, the cold biting at my skin like needles. The forest was alive, shifting and closing in around me. I heard laughter, deep, mocking laughter echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I finally collapsed, I thought it was the end. But I woke up hours later, lying on the side of the road. The forest was gone. My house was gone. Even the storm seemed to have passed. A kind stranger found me and took me to a shelter, but no one believed what I told them. I moved away from Texas after that, far from the memories of that storm and the horrors it brought. But sometimes, on cold nights, I hear it again. The whispering. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. If you're ever caught in a storm like that, listen carefully. Pay attention to the creaks, the whispers, the shadows, and whatever you do, don't open the door.